If you've ever felt like life is so loud you can't hear God, this talk is for you. Today, I'm going to show you why you feel spiritually disconnected, why your mind feels cluttered, and why it's so hard to discern God's direction. We'll discuss three things that change the way you hear God. First, we have the noise problem. Why you can't hear God when everything else is loud. Second, God speaks through order, not chaos. And third, a weekly listening structure, a simple rhythm that helps you hear God in a consistent manner. So, with that, let's get into it. Where do we start? Well, let's start with the first point that we said we were going to talk about, the noise problem. Most people don't struggle with God being silent, they struggle with life being loud. So, you ask yourself, okay, Suds, I hear you talking. What does that mean? What does it mean, life is loud? Well, it means many things, but some examples: your schedule is loud, your responsibilities are loud, your phone is loud, your thoughts are loud, your stress is loud. You get the idea. But the more important thing is, why is this important? You ask yourself that question. Hopefully, you're asking it of yourself right now so that you start to think, that's what I'm going to listen for. Bottom line, when everything else is loud, God's voice doesn't disappear, it just gets drowned out. So now we need to understand what is loud that will drown out God's voice. Let's take a reference example where God tells us about how he speaks. In 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah didn't hear God in the wind. He didn't hear him in the earthquake, and he didn't hear him in the fire. He heard him in a still, small voice. Imagine that, a small voice. Not normally what we attribute to God. In addition to God the Father, Jesus himself modeled this. In Mark chapter 1, when it says he went off to a solitary place to pray, we need to recognize that even Christ, not because he couldn't hear the Father in the crowd, but because he chose a quiet place to stay aligned and be able to hear the Father. Maybe this is something for us to consider copying or mimicking. One additional reference that we have is David. He said in Psalm 46, "Be still," God's talking to him, "and know that I am God." Stillness in this case is a spiritual discipline. Remember that, spiritual discipline. We're going to talk about that later. Something to think about at this point: if your life is constantly in a reaction mode, you will always struggle to hear God because you're reacting to other things. We have an initial concept of how God speaks, that little voice. So let's go a little bit deeper into other aspects related to the context of how God speaks to us. He does not speak to us through chaos. He speaks to us in order. That is not chaos. In the react mode, we're in chaos. We know that God is a God of order. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, it says, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. Peace. And in John chapter 14, Jesus says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give it to you as the world gives." What does that mean? World. Okay, keep that in mind when we start talking about spirit and the world, when we talk about physical. At this point, I'd also like to remind anyone who's listening that God's peace comes to us in our spiritual domain and not from our physical or worldly domain. That's the kind of peace we get from God. It is unseen, but it is felt. I want to reiterate at this point that the blueprint provides a framework for acknowledging the fact that human nature is made up of these two domains. And we need to understand that in dealing with God, we are in the spiritual domain, as well as when we are dealing with evil. So why is this important here? Well, not only does it provide a framework for you to bring context to your study and experiences and you're listening to God, but it gives you a framework to say, this is something that I can contemplate when deciding what I need to be doing, and most importantly, why I need to be doing it. If I could start to come to grips with answering that question on why, that's where we start getting that internal peace. The blueprint helps you do that. When your life is aligned, alignment is key. You start to understand your purpose and your mission. And at that point, your spirit, remember that spiritual domain, it becomes sensitive because that's where you're going to feel the peace. When your life is chaotic, your spirit becomes confused. Most people think that they need more revelation at this point, not peace. They need to know more, not have a context for it. But what they really need is more alignment by using a structure or a framework or a blueprint to capture and see the alignment of purpose and mission. Remember this: when your identity is unclear, especially your identity to God, your priorities become scattered, your habits become inconsistent, and your spiritual rhythm is unstable. In situations such as these, you will always feel like God is distant. But when you create order, even simple order, clarity increases. Let's take a look real quick at Psalm 119. It says, "Your word is like a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." Think about it. A lamp doesn't light the whole road, it lights the next step. But you only see that step when your life is positioned to listen and to truly hear your next step. Take a break. If this is hitting home and you want a faith anchored system to bring clarity, purpose, and alignment back into your life, make sure you subscribe and check the link below for Faith Centered Life Planning Blueprint. The blueprint is built exactly for people who feel overwhelmed, stuck, or spiritually disconnected, and they want a structured way to hear God again. That's what it's designed for. Now, let's get practical and move on to the third subject we want to discuss today: our building a weekly listening structure. If you want to hear God consistently, you need a repeatable rhythm, not random moments of desperation. Today, I'll give you a simple structure you can start this week. First, daily anchor points. These are 2 short moments that you can exercise and take into account every day. The first is in the morning. Say a prayer. God, align my heart. Or, come, Holy Spirit. Or, Jesus, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The second is in the evening. We can pray, God, show me where you were present today. You simply reflect on your day. What this does for us is this mirrors Psalm 5 and 63, where David says, "In the morning, I lay my request before you, and I meditate on you throughout the watches of the night." These 2 anchors alone will change your awareness and sensitivity for listening to God. Remember, that's what we want. The second part, a weekly reflection or a weekly rhythm. When do we do this? Once a week for 15 or 20 minutes. During this reflection, I recommend asking yourself 3 questions. First question, what is God highlighting for me this day, this week? Second question, what is God correcting for me? Third question, what is God inviting me into? These reflections are aligned to Lamentations chapter 3 that says, "Let us examine our ways and return to the Lord." So that's key. We examine, we think about what we did, we think about where we're going, and we put it in context of the Lord. Put it in context of God. What does that do? Reflection creates spiritual momentum. Spiritual. Remember that we were talking about peace earlier. We want spiritual momentum. We want to create that peace. And this leads us to the final point of today's discussion, and that is structure. The first point in this structure is the fact that we need to create a quiet space for discernment and listening. Remember what we mentioned earlier regarding Christ getting away to a quiet place, something he did often throughout the gospel? In all of the different gospels, according to the different writers. Okay, so next we block off the time each week, even 15 or 20 minutes. During this time, there will be no phone, no noise, no agenda, just presence. Jesus modeled this repeatedly. Specifically, in Luke chapter 5, he says, and it said of him, he would often withdraw to lonely places and pray. Friends, use this as your example. When you create space, God fills it. When you create order, God speaks into it. When you create rhythm, God reveals purpose through it. So there you have it. How to possibly hear God. How do we hear him? Take those into account. As a recap, we discussed 3 things that will help you hear God's direction, even when life is loud. The first is the noise problem. God isn't silent. Life is noisy. Be prepared to listen. Reference is 1 Kings chapter 12. Second, God speaks through order. Clarity comes from alignment, not chaos. The reference is 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And third, a weekly listening structure, daily anchors, weekly reflection in a quiet space. What that's contained in is the referencer Psalm 5 and Luke chapter 5. And so I leave you, my friends, with a final thought. If you build this rhythm, you will hear God more clearly, more consistently, and with more confidence. And as we close, if you want to go deeper and build a faith-anchored life plan that brings order, clarity, and purpose to every part of your life, check out the Faith-Centered Life Planning Blueprint link below. And if this talk helped you, hit subscribe, drop a comment, book a call. Let's set up an appointment for us to chat and maybe share it with someone who needs clarity today. God bless, and say a prayer for discernment. I will.
If interested in follow-on gifts or discussion, book a discovery call with Tom Sudbeck with the link in the description below.